the East Indian Company, and this is where it took place. This is the very first corporation to divide its property in shares, and that's what I tell you the story about in my book, the ideas of freedom driving development, that you can find in Amazon. And in this book, I explain the beginnings of capitalism and how it all started.
Would lead to the inception of history's first publicly traded company. The VOC, or United East India Company, was devised to use money from private investors to launch trade ventures in Asia.
On the one hand, the United East India Company was founded as a commercial trading company. On the other hand, there were political motives for establishing it.
The book, The Ideas of Freedom Driving Development, covers the history of economics and how it has impacted humanity and the world in the different places where economic development has been used. And as we saw in the case of Amsterdam and the VOC, which was the first traded company, which means that the ownership of the company was divided into shares. Well, economics and the history of economics has encountered different stages, and we see that freedom and the freedom that these inventions and these innovations have brought have enhanced freedom for the individual. So the first chapter that we see in the book is libertas, or the ideas of freedom that drive development. And we see a philosophical point of view of freedom and what are the ideas that came from there. And then on chapter 2, we see the incentives that individuals have in order to invest, in order to work, in order to have an economic point of view and try to see how it brings development to their own lives. We also see stakeholders and how these stakeholders, based on the incentives that the different economic models that bring, how do they behave? Do they invest? Do they save? What kind of jobs do they reach out? And how freedom, it's all related to this subject. Then on the third subject, we see the history, the economy, and the society, and how freedom in its different ways of shaping has evolved into modern lifestyles. So we cover that, and we see as an example of Amsterdam and how the VOC and free trade had a large impact into making it an empire previous to England and the United Kingdom. Well, what are those effects that we can see in history? And then we see the economic revolution that the neoliberal or libertarian model brought to Chile started in the 1970s, and how the poverty levels went down from 58% to less than 8% once the model was implemented, and how it had an effect in the rest of Latin America, where poverty levels on the average went down 20 years ago around 50% to 20%. Well, that 30% is thanks to trade, thanks to freedom-based economic models that were implemented in some of those countries. Then we see the case of Costa Rica and how free trade has helped to implement the ideas of freedom, and how free trade has brought better jobs, better income, better economic outlook for the Costa Ricans based on this model that, based on the ideas of freedom, have brought economic growth for Costa Rican and its citizens. And then we see the new economic revolution And that is taking place in Argentina in the last 1.5, 2 years with President Milei, and how they have implemented this program in order to lower regulations, open trade, open markets, and lower also public expenditure in order to leave a lot of the entrepreneurship and companies, etc., to leave the economic development to the private sector. So Argentina would be the new economic revolution based in a lot of other models, mainly Chile, also the experience of Costa Rica in free trade. For instance, Costa Rica is one of the leading countries in the world in knowledge-based exports. And that's another area where, learning from those examples, Argentina, it's taking this new route away from public or government intervention, and trying to have a new economic revolution based on these models. Then we see another chapter, the future, and what does the future look like for Latin America. We know, as I mentioned in the introduction, that protectionism and economic protectionism is on the rise in the world. Well, so what does it mean for Latin America and those countries? As I said, they have embraced freedom-based economic models, and how they can, under these new circumstances, keep on exporting. There is a regionalism, and what does it entail, and how does it change? Then we have another chapter of epilogue where I summarize some of these thoughts and leave some other ideas. So basically, that's what the book covers. As I said, starting from the ideas of freedom, moving into the incentives, and what are those incentives, how do they work, and how do they shape the lives of stakeholders, and what types of stakeholders. Stakeholders can be good or can be not so good for economic development. And then, as I said, we see these three different countries. We see the historic and economic, from the subsistence economic models to the Dutch Republic and the East India Company. And then we see the different models that have evolved, Keynesian type of development, economic development, but also libertarian, Hayek, Milton Friedman, and what are their contribution to economic development. Um, and then we see these three different cases, as in the case of Chile. What's the importance of Chile? How did it change the ecosystem in terms of ideas based on freedom, and how these ideas based on freedom have contributed to economic growth, to a better standard of living of its citizens, but also of other countries that have developed different policies and market systems based on those ideas. I was privileged to work for an international organization in the 1980s and 1990s, where some of these ideas from the Chilean economic model were implemented in other countries. So I cover that, and we see what are those countries, what are the policies and market systems that have evolved in other countries based on that. And then we go into detail in two other countries, and one of them is Costa Rica, and how the free trade has helped implement the ideas of freedom, and how, private pension plans, also another idea from the Chilean economic model, has helped raise the national savings rates, which also helps, to deepen the financial system. So we see the case of Costa Rica, starting from the ideas of free trade, and then the other country that we see is Argentina, which is as I mentioned, is the new paradigm of um, economic revolution and some of the ideas from the Chilean model that have been implemented with President Milei for the last year and a half, 2 years. Well, what are those, and how is it impacting, and what are the efforts that they have to make in order to change from uh, government intervention to more freedom-based ideas and policies? And then, we cover the future. What is the future looking like for these countries and for Latin America and for the world in terms of the ideas of freedom that drive development? So basically, that's what we see in the book. You can find it in Amazon, in ebook or digital version, but also in paperback version. You can, purchase it in Amazon, and it will be delivered to your doorstep. So the ideas of freedom driving development.